A really good view on this skull. Right here on the lateral inferior aspect, and on this side, again, the lateral inferior aspect, that nasal concha is just sort of attached on either side, and it helps with drainage of the sinuses. So that is the inferior nasal concha. It's its own bone. Okay. And the vomer, the last bone. Peggy always thought it looked like a plow, a little plow going through the fields. This is called the vomer. Where is it located? If the ethmoid was the superior dividing point of the nose, the vomer is the inferior dividing point. So it kind of sits like this. The ethmoid is superior, and this bone is inferior, and together they form the bony part of the nasal septum. Anterior to these perpendicular plate and the vomer is the cartilage of the nose, which forms the nasal cartilage in between the right and left halves of the nose. Posteriorly, you can see the vomer because it sits here. Here is the dividing point from either nasal choana on the posterior aspect, and where it sits, where it's adhered to the bone below, are the ala of the vomer, or wings. So this little part right here on either side, right here, these are the ala of the vomer. So this is the anterior aspect of the vomer, which divides the nose into right and left halves, and this is the posterior part of the vomer. Okay. All right. And now the last thing we have to cover are the sutures. So when the skull is being formed, and it's still a baby, we have all these soft spots or fontanelles, which are sort of the fibrocartilaginous parts that hold the skull together, allow for easy delivery through the birth canal, and for growth in youth. Once we finish growing, it's thought that these sutures become hardened and the skull thus is immovable. There's debate about that. So what we see in the skull when we look at sutures is the suture that goes in the coronal plane is the coronal suture, and that divides the frontal bone from the parietal bones. So coronal suture in the coronal plane. Sometimes it's referred to also as the frontal plane. From the top of the skull, we can see this suture that divides into right and left halves, the parietal bones on either side, and that is the sagittal suture, and that goes in the sagittal plane. On the lateral side of the skull, dividing the temporal bone from the parietal bone, right here, this is the squamosal suture. Squamous or squamosal suture. And here, on the posterior aspect of this skull, hold still skull, posterior aspect, we have the lambda, or upside down Greek letter Y, lambda, or as a student liked to tell me, this suture at the back of the skull is the lambdoidal suture. Lambda is the Greek letter Y. So this is the lambdoidal suture on the posterior aspect. There's many more sutures, but these are the main ones you need to know. Now, in a baby, the frontal bone is two bones, actually. And most of the time, by the time we're about 8 years old, this suture fuses, and it's not a problem. It's just one bone. So looking at this little baby's skull, one bone. You can see remnants of this little suture right here, right above the nasal bones. But in about 8% of the population, this suture never totally closes, and it's referred to as the metopic suture. Metopic meaning forehead, so the metopic suture. It's also referred to, because it is the frontal bone, as the frontal suture. Okay, so nothing wrong with it, not too common, but it is seen. Okay, so those are the sutures. Then the sinuses. So the best skull to see these sinuses on was the smoker. The frontal sinuses, again, there's 4 pair of paired sinuses. Frontal sinus, oh my gosh, I have to stop. I'm sorry. Oh my God, I didn't even look at the time. I've got a class.